But before we go into this panel, my friend Richard Reeves has a slight elaboration he wants to make of something that was said in the panel before. Richard.
It was the question of Nkrumah meeting, I forgot which president it was actually. At any rate, when I said that conversations with foreign leaders are and always have been recorded, either stenographically or on tape, that doesn't mean they become public. They exist, but we may never, ever know what was actually said between. So the fact that they're recorded doesn't mean they become public.
Thank you. Now, let me explain that this session, which goes until 12:30, is basically divided into three parts, taking three presidents chronologically and listening to people who know about it talk about insights on these presidents. We'll first hear from Bob Doyle on FDR, and then Richard Reeves on JFK, and then Stanley Cutler, I guess I have to say, on RMN, right? Everybody's initials here. Two of the presenters will use tape excerpts as part of their presentations. So let's start with Bill Doyle.
Thank you, Dan. For 11 weeks in 1940, Franklin Roosevelt experimented with the first secret audio recording system in the Oval Office. And it's an experiment that lets us, 60-plus years later, listen to sit beside him as he tries to steer the nation through its greatest 20th century crisis, through the approach of that crisis, the Second World War. On October 4th, one of these recordings captured Roosevelt meeting with two of his Democratic leaders in Congress, House Speaker Sam Rayburn and Floor Leader John McCormick. Now, the war had already erupted across Europe and in China, and the presidential election was just weeks away. Republican Wendell Willkie was pulling even with Roosevelt in some polls. Now, what you're about to hear is an antique recording, of a Roosevelt soliloquy. It's a bootleg recording that FDR never intended for us to hear, but you can hear quite clearly the theatrical flourishes of his voice. You'll hear him pound the table 17 times to make a point, and the tension in the air as he faced a dilemma not completely dissimilar to the one faced by our current president: how to prepare for war overseas while protecting the cities of the United States from attack and the American people from panic.
Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan might feel that if they could stop American munitions from flowing to England, planes, guns, aircraft, guns, ammunition, and so forth, that they could lick England. Now, they might send us an ultimatum. If you continue to send anything to England, we will regard that as an attack on us. Now, there will be in this country, if that happens, a great deal of scared feeling, panic. There'll be a lot of people that will say, my God, we ought to keep some of these planes back here. We haven't got enough of these planes to defend ourselves. We ought not to send every other plane over to England. We haven't got enough anti-aircraft guns for Boston, New York, Washington, D.C. Sure, it's perfectly true. And there'll be a demand that we pull right inside of ourselves, and keep everything we're making for our own defense. That's what they're saying. And that's just what they want to do. Now, this morning, it's a terrible attack on Lehman, because what Lehman said is that the Axis powers, there's no question about it, would give anything in the world to have me licked on the 5th of November.
You'll notice, of course, that his guests can't get a word in edgewise, which is pretty much the routine at many of his meetings. From August to November of 1940, Roosevelt recorded 14 Oval Office press conferences as a backup to his stenographer's notes. But sometimes he forgot to shut the thing off, and the machine captured private conversations and meetings that started right after the reporters left the office. These recordings are a complete accident, the meetings. The FDR tapes illustrate one of the richest facets of his presidency, and that is he's madly in love with his job. Jeffrey Ward, the historian, marveled after listening to his tapes. He is trapped behind his desk, and what's astonishing to me is what a great time he's having. The tapes often capture Roosevelt's breezy, stream-of-consciousness office atmosphere of informality, tackling random slices of White House business, shifting from one task to the other with dizzying speed, and interacting with his staff with effervescent charm. He is aristocratic, gossipy, commanding, and occasionally devious. Often you can hear his high-pitched, convulsive laughter bouncing off the Oval Office walls, usually in reaction to one of his own pithy remarks. What were the issues on his mind in this small window of his presidency? One of them was affirmative action, or proportional representation, as it was then known, the move to get black Americans into the thoroughly segregated U.S. military. On September 27, 1940, a delegation of the top civil rights leaders of the United States marched into the Oval Office to lobby Roosevelt to take a stand on the issue. But on the other side of the room were his own government officials dead set against integration, and Roosevelt had no immediate intention of doing this either. At one point in the meeting, Roosevelt had an idea for how to increase black participation in the Navy.
We are training a certain number of musicians on board ship. The ship's band. There's no reason why we shouldn't have a colored band on some of these ships because they're darn good at it. And that's something that we should look into. In other words, it'll increase the opportunities. That's what we're at.
Now, even in 1940, I think it took a special kind of patrician obliviousness to say that to the black leaders of the nation, to their faces. Later in the meeting, Roosevelt claimed to be putting black troops right in, proportionally, into the combat services, which was in fact far from the case. The trouble with the president, Harry Truman once said, is that he lies. Perhaps the most chilling FDR recording occurred during an informal staff meeting on October 8, 1940, a recording that illustrates that even the greatest of presidents can sometimes sense disaster coming but be totally powerless to stop it. And by the way, the Roy Howard he refers to on this tape is the head of the Scripps Howard newspaper chain and a vicious FDR critic.
Look, but here's one thing I wanted to ask my old friend the Scripps Howard papers about. One of your old friends. They're all your friends. Now look, before you read that, I want to ask you this. Roy the other day received, Roy Howard, a telegram, apparently, which was published, I think UP carried it, all UP papers. A telegram, as I remember it, from the chief of the Japanese Press Association, whatever it is. Mr. Naga. What? Mr. Naga. Well, evidently an old friend of Roy's. In which Mr. Naga, or whatever his name was, said the damnedest thing that ever happened. I wouldn't prefer this because it only stir up bad feeling in this country, and this country is ready to pull the trigger if the Japs doing it. I mean, it won't stand their nonsense. Public opinion won't in this country from the Japs if they do some fool thing. Well, this Mr. Naga fellow wires to Roy and says, there will be no war with the United States, I'm quoting from memory, on one condition. And one condition only, and that is that the United States will recognize the new era in not the Far East, but the East, meaning the whole of the East. Furthermore, that this recognition, there must be evidence of it. And the only evidence of this recognition the United States can give is to demilitarize all of its naval and air and army places in Lake, Midway, and Pearl Harbor. God, that's the first time that any damn Jap has told us to get out of Hawaii.
Of course, Pearl Harbor was 14 months after that recording. FDR's recording experiment abruptly stopped on November 8, 1940, 3 days after his re-election to a third term. We don't know why. His recording machine stayed wired into his Oval Office desk lamp for the next 4.5 years, through all of World War II and to the end of his presidency, but no other recordings were ever found.
Bill, let me just add, for the sake of those seeing this on C-SPAN and maybe a little confused at times about the voices that you heard. The last voice you heard was the voice of President Roosevelt speaking in October of 1940, as Bill Taylor said. It was 13 months before Pearl Harbor, and it's interesting to me in the way in which history can be revised. We thought innocently attacked by the Japanese in December 1941, and we were minding our own business and not making trouble for anybody. But in October 1940, President Roosevelt was already speaking of the Japanese with enormous hostility. Interesting. Richard, this is now on President Kennedy.
It is, again, the importance of things like that is what the president knew and when he knew it and when he said it, which is critical, really, to doing any decent history. I mean, bad historians are people who take the context of today and superimpose it on an event 60 years ago, so that it's critical to understand the order in which things happen, which is one of the reasons I think that journalists have been effective in writing history over, whether it's David McCullough or David Halberstam or whoever. I also want to repeat the point that these things, interviews, tapes, and documents all go together in doing this, and I think that in this conference, which I think has been fantastic, that actually the two things that struck me the most came out in what were essentially interviews. That is, when Alex Butterfield said, of course, I know that Nixon knew about the burglary in advance, and Sheldon Stern talking about the impossibility, really, of thinking that John F. Kennedy did not know about Mongoose and other operations, which were essentially assassination plots. But there's been no smoking gun on them, but we got as good testimony here as so far to date that those two great post-war mysteries essentially have been solved by scholars. The one that will never be solved, that is what would Kennedy have done in Vietnam if he lived, we will never know. May 12, 1962, Birmingham, Alabama. John Kennedy wants to get a message to Martin Luther King, a man whom if they had ever met before then, he had never been photographed with, because Kennedy understood the importance of the body. That is, to be seen with the president, to be the public to know that you're in contact, essentially puts the president on your side, and the president doesn't go on people's side easily. And still at this point, it wasn't until 1963 and the March on Washington that John Kennedy sensed that the nation, that the train was leaving the station on civil rights. And after his I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King was invited to the White House for the first time to be photographed with the president, who had concluded now that history was rolling and he better get on board. So here we are. It's John Kennedy talking about seeing if King can be used to get blacks off the street in Birmingham.
What we want to get out of King is whether just how freely do you talk to King? I talk to him freely. Now, what he has said, he's issued a statement calling upon me to make a statement to say what our problem is here. We can make the statement, but there's going to be violence there tonight. That is obviously what Governor Wallace wants. So that we don't like to put troops in there, because then we think it's going to be more difficult for this thing to be, for a success to be made of this agreement. But we will if there's going to be violence there tonight. Now, can he keep? What is his judgment about that?
I haven't done that, sir.
Well, I think you ought to look like you're talking just on your own and without saying we're considering it then, but just what our problem is to try to make a judgment on whether the Negro community is going to be out in the street tonight. If it is, then we're going to have to put troops next. Either going to get beaten up or they're going to beat somebody up. The Negroes ought to keep off the street. Otherwise, we're just saying that the Negroes are being mistreated. I mean, I've got to put some word about the Negroes staying home, because otherwise it's just inflammatory about their abuses again without urging them to keep quiet, to permit an atmosphere to develop where the agreement of this week can be carried out.
So what is on Kennedy's mind really is order. I don't know who the other voice was. Do you, John? It might have been Harris Wofford. It was probably Harris Wofford who was... Yeah, could be. Harris Wofford, a white man who later became a senator from Pennsylvania, was Kennedy's first civil rights director, which tells you something about the time. And Kennedy's most famous order to him when he found out about the Freedom Rides, which he found out by seeing the bus burning on the front page of the New York Times, was to call Wofford and tell him, get your goddamn friends off those buses. However, as time changed and he, as president, put the government on the side of the minority, which is no small thing in a democracy. The second segment is a monologue by Kennedy. We're in October 18th, 1962, the building of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy realizes this is the first time there's been a nuclear standoff between the two great nuclear powers, and Kennedy senses correctly that this is going to be, what happens is going to be a model and there's going to be history forever, for better or worse. And he dictates late that night his thoughts into a dictaphone. One of the few times he did that.
During the course of the day, opinions had obviously switched from the advantages of a first strike on the missile sites and on Cuban aviation to a blockade. Dean Acheson, with whom I talked this afternoon, favored, while he was uncertain about any of the courses, favored the first strike. That strike to take place just against the missile sites. When I saw Robert Lovett later after talking to Gromyko, he was not convinced that any action was desirable. He felt that the first strike would be very destructive to our alliances, particularly if the reprisal was to seize Berlin, and we'd be regarded as having brought about the loss of Berlin with inadequate provocation. Bundy continued to argue against any action on the grounds that there would be inevitably a Soviet reprisal. He felt we'd be better off to merely take note of the existence of these missiles and to wait until the crunch comes in Berlin and not play what he thought might be the Soviet game. Everyone else felt that for us to fail to respond would throw into question our willingness to respond over Berlin, would divide our allies and our country. The consensus was that we should go ahead with the blockade beginning on Sunday night. Originally, we should begin by blockading Soviet against the shipment of additional offensive capacity. That we could tighten the blockade as the situation required. I was most anxious that we not have to announce a state of war existing, because it would obviously be bad to have the word go out that we were having a war, rather than it was a limited blockade for a limited purpose. It was determined that I should go ahead with my speeches so that we don't take the cover off this and come back Saturday night.
The trip, most of us, I think, know, was to Chicago, where he was going to make a speech, and he did not want the world to know that the crisis had already begun, and that was when he got the fake cold in Chicago and came back to Washington. I don't know about you, but I never thought I'd hear anything like this. The next segment on Kennedy, I want to use as an example of how different the things we've talked about here are. That is, I knew that the president did not like a couple of people. Kennedy could pretty much get along with anyone and was a pretty gregarious fellow when he wanted to be. But among the people he did not like, the only other one I know he disliked as much was Curtis LeMay. Get that man out of his office, and never let him back in. It was James Webb, the head of NASA. And this, I wrote in my book in 1993 of the president's dislike for Webb. A sentence saying that is quite different from what you're about to hear, and also the public issue that they're arguing about is an argument that obviously continues today. The issue is, should we send men or machines into space? Webb is arguing that machines can do the job, forget about men. Kennedy keeps trying to tell him that this is not about science. That's good stuff, but it's not about that. It is about the Soviet Union, and it is about getting to the moon, and that's where the money's going to go, Mr. Webb, whether you like it or not. Webb doesn't get those signals, as you will hear.
You put this program, I think this program is the top priority program of the agency. No, sir, I do not. I think it is one of the top priority programs, but I think it's very important to recognize here that as you have found what you could do with the rocket, as you found how you could get it beyond the Earth's atmosphere and into space and make measurements, several scientific disciplines that are very powerful have begun to converge on this area. Yeah, I think it is the top priority. I think we ought to have that very clear. But the environment of space is where you're going to operate the Apollo and where you're going to do the landing. No, but I know all these other things and the satellite, the communications and weather and all. They're desirable, but they can wait for. Oh, no, I'm not putting those. I'm talking there about the scientific program to understand the space environment within which you've got to fly Apollo and make a landing on the moon. That's part of that saying. Well, no, wait a minute. Is that saying that the lunar program, the land, the man, and the moon is the top priority of the agency? Is it? And the science that goes with it. The science. Going to the moon is the top priority project. Now, there are a lot of related scientific information and developments that will come from that, which are important. But the whole thrust of the agency, in my opinion, is the lunar program. The rest of it can wait 6 or 9 months. I would certainly not favor spending $6 to $7 billion to find out about space, no matter how, on the schedule we're doing. I'd spell it out over a 5 or 10 year period. If we could spend it on, why are we spending $7 billion on getting fresh water from salt water when we're spending $7 billion to find out about space? So I think we've got to take the view that this is the key program, and the rest of it, not so that we can find out about it, but there's a lot of things we want to find out about. But you see, when you talk about this, it's very hard to draw a line between what I think everything that we do ought to really be tied into getting onto the moon and ahead of the Russians. Otherwise, we shouldn't be spending this kind of money because I'm not that interested in space. I think it's good. I think we ought to know about it. We're ready to spend reasonable amounts of money, but we're talking about these fantastic expenditures which wreck our budget and all these other domestic programs. And the only justification for it, in my opinion, to do it is not how fast it is because we hope to beat them and demonstrate that starting behind it, we did by a couple of years. By God, we passed them.
That's a politician and a scientist talking, and you can't get that in one sentence. It's too bad we won't have that for all our presidents, as someone said here today. Thank you.
Okay. And now historian Stanley Cutler on our man, Richard Nixon.
Well, obviously, I think the Nixon tapes are unique. There is nothing like them. They offer an incredible, unprecedented view of a man in the cockpit of the presidency. We have never heard a president in such a full, incredible range of emotions. He's thoughtful, he's insensitive, he's clear-minded, he's vague. What the hell is he talking about? You ask time and again. He's very vicious at times, he's maudlin, he's hypocritical, he's self-pitying. Now, one thing that distinguishes Richard Nixon's tapes from all the others we've talked about here today, the others all have their finger on the button. They record when they want to record. Nixon's, as you heard yesterday, are voice activated. That makes them, in a qualitative sense, that gives them a different legitimacy as a source for a historian, as opposed to when the president is consciously making his record. Let me give you an example, because it's serious and it's fun. Try to imagine, if you will, JFK or Lyndon Johnson putting their fingers on the button to record this series of talks. It's April 30th, 1973. Richard Nixon has just appeared on national television. He has accepted the resignation, to use the language, of Haldeman and Ehrlichman. As he said, he cut off his right arm. He's also, at that moment, fired John Dean and asked for the resignation of Richard Kleindienst. It's a clean sweep throughout the White House. He finishes the speech, and thankfully he's on the telephone, so all the fidelity is nice and clear. And clearly Richard Nixon has been drinking. I don't hear the ice cubes tingling in the glass, as one reporter claims she has, but I do know when words are slurred, when speech patterns are slowed and confused, and all this is a man drinking and full of self-pity. Well, after the speech, he calls Bob Haldeman. He's just, in effect, fired him. He calls Haldeman, and, how did things go? Oh, it's fine, Mr. President, and so forth. And then Nixon launches into this tirade. Only Cap Weinberger has called me. Nobody else has called me. It's der Troja Weinberger has called him. But no one else has called me. They're not loyal, and so forth. Haldeman quietly says, Mr. President, you left orders not to have anyone call you. Oh. So, wow, I didn't mean that, and so forth. And he goes on. And he says to Haldeman, by the way, could you check around with the reporters to see how I did with the speech? He's just fired him. Haldeman says, no, I don't think so. So he hangs up the phone, and then comes this flood of phone calls. Everybody now can get through to the president. There's Billy Graham. There's Elliot Richardson, who's been named the new Attorney General. He hasn't fired yet. William Rogers, the Secretary of State, and Nixon's longtime friend, a businessman, Hobart Lewis, and Chuck Colson. Later, he talks to Haldeman again, and he's just, he's drowning at this point. And he says, Bob, I love you. I love you like a brother. I mean, these kinds of words you never hear from Richard Nixon. And it's an extraordinary performance. But the main point here is I can't imagine any other president, putting his finger on the button to record himself like that. Now, it tells you, this whole series, it tells you a lot about Richard Nixon. It doesn't reveal any factual information that's important. But interesting, he's asking Haldeman once again to check the PR of it all. He's always asking that. Well, the tapes must be used with caution, and above all with what historians call critical methodology. Without getting too elaborate or in the clouds on this, we must consider a variety of factors to evaluate the validity of tapes. To put it simply, I would say that tapes fall into three categories. There are those tapes that are clearly very, very revealing. There are those tapes that are contrived, cooked, if you will. And third, we don't know. So you have three simple categories here. Now, the former historian, Henry Kissinger, always has railed against the use of, in his prior existence, he was a historian. He always has railed against the use of the tapes from the Oval Office. He's warned about the danger of taking things out of context and having no sense of the atmospherics of the Oval Office, which means, of course, only he can do this and no one else should try. That's a rather curious posture for the man who explored and purported to understand the mind of Prince Metternich and the European balance of power at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. As more tapes emerge, with Richard Nixon in the starring lead and Henry Kissinger in the chief supporting role, I understand his reluctance to have the tapes. I understand it only too well. He's not going to do well as time goes on. There's more and more emerging now. But he does offer us, he dons his old hat of being a historian, and he does offer us a warning about the dangers here. He's describing the Christmas bombing of Hanoi, 1972. He's down in the basement office for the National Security Council, secretary, whatever it's called, and he gets a call from Haldeman to come up to the Oval Office. He comes up there. There's Haldeman standing by the side of the president's desk. Richard Nixon's over in the corner, much as John Dean described for you before. Nixon's over in the corner, and Haldeman wheels on him and says, "What is the meaning of this? What are we doing? Why are we bombing?" and so forth. Kissinger's taken aback. He and Nixon have been discussing this for several weeks. They've worked out the policy and everything. But Kissinger suffers from occupational disease. He's a professor. You ask him a question, he's got to give you an answer. He starts justifying this whole thing. And Haldeman is like playing devil's advocate. Well, what about this? And so forth. He had Nixon sitting in the corner the whole time. And, Kissinger says that he's taken aback. Haldeman did discuss the substance of foreign policy with him. And here's going on. Later, when Kissinger really understands about the taping system, as he writes in his memoirs, he realizes, I was being set up in case the policy went wrong. Then we trot out the tape. Well, the same thing with the revelation of the existence of the plumber's role in breaking into Ellsberg's psychiatrist. One day, during Ellsberg's trial, it's Ehrlichman, I believe, who comes in and tells the president that they found this out, that the Justice Department now knows there was this break-in, and they're obligated to tell the court in Los Angeles what happened. And Nixon grumbles and so forth. And then over the next few days, there's a succession of visitors, John Dean being one, and others. "Oh, Mr. President, this thing about the break-in, oh, yeah, what about that?" Like he'd never heard of it. Well, Nixon and his people always said the tapes will, quote, exonerate him. To which I always said, well, then let's have them if they're going to exonerate you. What he meant, of course, was the selective use of them, which would have meant going back to San Clemente and spending the next century clipping and pasting tapes. One of the best cartoons at the time was one by Paul Conrad of the LA Times. It showed Nixon in black shadow as a mummy, wrapped in reel of tape, was Haldeman, Dean, Ehrlichman, and so forth. But, he always contended the tapes were going to exonerate him. If you could have used them selectively, yeah. Now, no doubt we have the words of Nixon, but just as pictures can lie, let it be noted that President Nixon, to be charitable, was not always the most truth-telling of men. We must not automatically and uncritically use the tapes. We ask important questions. How did he say them? Were they contrived to make a record? Do they make sense? What's the sense of them in the larger context they were made? Consider a year ago now, the archives had its last release. And across the country, you read, Nixon wants to drop atomic bomb. Wanted to drop atomic bomb on the North Vietnamese. It was terribly unfair to do that. Terribly unfair. For 4 months, in the spring of '72, Nixon finally understands that he's not going to win that war. But two things. One, he's got to get the POWs. Two, one more time, he wants to pace the Vietnamese. So he's after General Abrams. I got to have a victory and so forth. He's arguing with Henry Kissinger. This goes on day after day. One day, Kissinger's in the Oval Office, and Kissinger says he's enormously frustrated. He's angry. He says, "I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to drop a nuclear bomb on the North Vietnamese." And Kissinger quietly says, "Well, now, that would not be a good idea." But to take this remark out of context, the man is angry. He's frustrated. This is not history. It's a wonderful, wonderful soundbite. But if you go over the tapes of those 4 months, you find a president in anguish, frustration, anger about Vietnam. Well, quite clearly, the best use to date of the tapes has been John Dean's book, The Rehnquist Choice. It's a splendid example of what can be done. John, of course, was blessed with wonderful material, and as he pointed out to you, on the telephone, again, the fidelity being very, very good. A great deal of scholarly ink, I can tell you, has been spilled over the subject of how and why presidents make nominations to the court. We have nothing like this, thanks very much to the tapes. We've never been so blessed with sources as we are for a 1-month period, October of '71, which climaxed in the nominations of Lewis Powell and William Rehnquist. 30 years later, those decisions continue to reverberate. Just ask Al Gore. The tape, as alluded to before, the tape between Nixon and Powell is the man at his best. He's making a forceful case to plead with Powell to come on the court. He's extremely anxious to have Powell. It was nothing but pluses for him. He appeases the South. He gets a so-called moderate, a word with magical properties in American media life, a former president of the American Bar Association. No Harold Carswell here. This is good stuff. And he wants him. Okay. We learn also from these tapes that Senator Howard Baker was offered a seat on the court. He dallied. He did, and Nixon withdrew it and gave the nomination to William Rehnquist. You want to think about that one for a little bit. Now, all this, we could have inferred, we inferred from the documents as they were released, not all of this, about the Baker thing, because it'd be inferred from the documents released 15 years ago. But there was really no clinching evidence. There's nothing like the tapes. The tapes talk, Mrs. Nixon was exerting enormous pressure. He nominated a woman. And he keeps telling his staff he wants a woman. Well, they find one woman in the country who's qualified. They can only find one. Mildred Lilly out in California. And Herschel Friday, a bond lawyer in Little Rock. He's going to put these nominations through. And then he realizes the ABA is going to turn them down. But he's going to turn this to his advantage. The ABA is going to turn down a woman. I tried. So, this is all to his advantage. But for those of you who love your sound bites, you have a wonderful moment in these where Mitchell quietly says to the president, you remember they forced Abe Fortas off the bench. Mr. President, when are you going to fill the Jewish seat? Nixon silent. When I die. Now, despite my injunctions about sound bites, I have a couple for you here. Let me try to give you, though, some of the larger contexts. This involves Richard Nixon, Alexander Haig. It's after the firing, the resignations of Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and J. Fred Bizard, who was now White House counsel. He was really manning the Watergate role at this point. He was Alexander Haig's classmate, by the way, and it was Haig's choice to be there. They're talking about the break-in of Ellsberg psychiatrists and how they're going to have to put all this under the umbrella of national security. Presidents like to talk about national security, and they're doing so with the engineer. But they're talking about that the nation is at war with itself, sinister forces are threatening the government, and the publication of the Pentagon Papers could have been fatal, and so forth. So Nixon's talking about these various things he was going to do. The Houston Plan, which would have involved illegal break-ins on the part of the government, and then the plumbers' operation against Ellsberg. I think that these discussions, it comes up here and it comes up in some other places. They cut to the heart of the story of a question that people rarely ask, but I think is really the heart of the matter. And that is, why didn't Richard Nixon ever come forth and say, I did it? Come on television, I did it. I did it to save you from the commies, from the rapists, the abortionists, the druggies, whatever. I don't think this country wanted to force a president from office in 1973, early 74. I think Richard Nixon would have gone home to San Clemente on January 20th, 1977, had he done this. I think. But why doesn't he do this? Presidents today, they come out with this kind of apology, and it's okay now to shed a tear or two. It's not unmacho anymore. Why didn't he do it? Well, he tells you here at two places on this little excerpt I'm going to give you that for the president to admit that he had done an illegal act, he couldn't do it. Why? Because for 25 years, Richard Nixon had generated and fostered this image of a law and order man. He was Mr. Law and Order, and now he's going to tell you he sponsored illegal break-ins? that was too excruciatingly painful for him to admit. He could not bring himself to admit it. And so he goes back to San Clemente a little bit earlier. So just we'll play this just about 2 minutes.
Now, the issue here is that there are two things that have to be ironed out. One is, I have to make a pretty good case. We had flabby, ineffective internal security at a time when it was riots.
That's Haig.
This was just after Cambodia, just after Kent State.
Right. And secondly, what we've got to tie in, Fred, you can't go with this until you can get the lines carefully traced the best we can on the Watergate situation. Certainly we can see the break-in that the psychiatrist found afterwards.
Yep. The lines are there.
Now, you can't just fire that without the other.
Yeah. You've got
Then
to.
becomes you got to tie it all.
I don't think we can, I don't know whether we can avoid it. I don't see, I believe some way I've got to avoid having the president approve the break-in at the psychiatrist's office.
You didn't approve that specific one.
Yeah, I approve it.
But you know the policy.
We had a hell of a problem. I didn't know this was going on. Did you know?
No, I didn't, sir. I knew that there was
A plan. I see.
I knew there was an emergency group.
Yeah, that's fine. And then but when I say I knew what was going on, and I didn't know they were breaking into private residences if they did.
Well, I had to do about it.
And that's what my whole point. That I think was a great big scheme here. But my point is they have to have proof. Whoever takes this on has got to prove. Before we go out on something like this, let us be sure that we see what they got.
We'll see what they've got.
You see my point?
I think the point is, though,
Yeah.
that if you say there was nothing or there was this only, we've got to make darn sure
Oh, yeah.
that's all.
I understand.
We've got to be absolutely correct.
My point is, let us not assume that because there was a big plan of this sort in the government, that the opposition now has a great number of cases like the hijackers put in. They would have the goddamn things out. Now that's my point. I think that's.
I don't think they know. I really don't think they know of any specific instance, and frankly, I'm not sure there was even one.
My feeling is that this is one time an old man Hoover in his village. I
know
know
that.
there's a favor. He probably wouldn't allow it. I don't know why it was, but he never wanted to do it. I don't know why he.
That was Richard Nixon. I've been handed a note saying that because of the weather, apparently oncoming snow, I should try to finish as close as possible to noon, which it almost is. I have a choice of asking, I have a couple of questions I could have asked our two panelists, but I've decided in the interest of democracy that I will instead take two questions from the floor if there are questions from the floor.
Besides, like the presidents taping other people, we know that J. Edgar Hoover taped presidents also. Have any of these tapes come to light? Are they in the FBI vaults? Did Hoover destroy them? Or we've also heard possible taping of bugging of Nixon's campaign plane in '68. Do any of you have any sources that you could reveal that would shed any light on this?
I don't know Stanley's answer, but my preliminary answer is that Nixon at times said that his campaign plane in 1968 was bugged by still President Johnson. That appears to have been exploded. It apparently didn't. What apparently did happen is that there was a tap put on the embassy of South Vietnam. They wanted to find out whether there was going to be an October surprise, that is to say, a ceasefire agreement which might have affected Humphrey's chances in the election. Other than that, the idea of bugging Nixon was typical Nixon paranoia.
Well, as far as no tape has ever showed up out of the Johnson library, as far as I know, about bugging the tape. But Bob Dallek, in his book on Lyndon Johnson, goes into this rather elaborately on how Johnson knew what was going on in the campaign of '68 in terms of the contacts between John Mitchell, Anna Chennault, and the South Vietnamese, all of which was delaying the Paris peace talks. Now, we know that. And in fact, there's a later incident in the Nixon administration where Johnson makes it clear he's going to let people know about this if they didn't stop bothering him about other things. I think it's as far as J. Edgar Hoover's end of things, well, you know, Hoover had no secret files or anything like that. Well, that's what we were told, so why would I believe that he had any tapes of presidents? I'm not sure, to tell you the truth.
Sir.
This is directed towards Mr. Doyle. Does the excerpt we heard from FDR lead one to believe that he wished for the United States to go to war before the events of 1941?
No, and there's a lot of bad history on that speculation. What that proves is that, like George W. Bush, and anybody who read the newspapers in 1940 or the year 2001, you could reasonably expect there to be an attack by the Japanese then or Al-Qaeda in 2001, but there was no possible way of sorting the thousands of threats that were fake from the real specific timetable of the attack. So it shows you that he was powerless to do anything about that threat in addition to all the others he faced, I believe.
And so regretfully, because I myself would like to go on for many hours with this, but I just happen to be a tape nut, a presidential nut, and last but not least, a Nixon nut. So I want to thank Bill Doyle, who illuminated the career of Franklin Roosevelt, and Stanley Cutler on Nixon, and Richard Reeves, who had to leave a few minutes early. If you're listening on C-SPAN or radio, thank you, Richard Reeves, too, and thanks to all of you.